Okay, I think we'll make a start. I'm delighted to welcome you to the first Centre for Global Higher Education seminar at Lancaster. The Centre for Global Higher Education is an ESRC HEFGE funded research centre that's a partnership between Lancaster, led by UCL Institute of Education, and also Sheffield in the UK, and another 8 universities internationally. For our first seminar, we have the findings from another ESRC project looking at dynamics of knowledge creation. I've had involvement in this project by being on the, I think, advisory committee, it was called, and also I took part in some of the piloting of some of the instruments with Ibrar. Before we get moving on the seminar, we'll do what we normally do in the department, which is just to go around the room and ask people to introduce themselves and say who they are and where they're from. We'll start with Dee because Colin's just taken a mouthful of sandwich. So.
Dee Daglish, Educational Research.
Janja Komnevich, Educational Research.
Simon Marginson, Director of the ESRC HEFGE Centre for Global Higher Education, and my field is basically international and global aspects of higher education, but I've found myself working on inequality in higher education a lot in the last 2 years.
Vicky Gordon, Educational Research. Gemma Derrick, Educational Research.
Rebecca Marston, Educational Research.
Linguistic researcher from the University of Helsinki.
Steve Dennison from Educational Research. Corin Rogers recently departed from Educational Research.
Okay, so there's that signing sheet going around, so you can tell us that information all again. And just to remind people that the seminar is being live streamed. So the microphones will pick up your conversations as we move on through. And if people on the live stream have questions, they can email them to Rebecca at edresseminars, which has a double S in the middle between res and seminars, edresseminars@lancaster.ac.uk. So I'll now hand over to Mary, Karin, David and Ibrar to give us our seminar.
Okay, well thank you very much. We're really delighted to have been asked to make a presentation on our project today. This is the title of the presentation, The Dynamics of Knowledge Creation, Academics Changing Writing Practices, and we've added international implications for this seminar, although that's not in the title of our project itself. This is a 2-year ESRC funded project that started in January 2015 and will finish into the new year. So it's still ongoing, and we're still collecting data, although we've been doing quite a lot of analysis as we've been going through. Our project team is Karin Tusting, who is here, who is our PI, David Barton, who is from the Linguistics department, who is here. Sorry, Karin is from Linguistics as well. Ibrar, who is from Educational Research and who is one of the 2 senior research associates on the project. I'm Mary Hamilton, I'm in Educational Research. Sharon McCulloch is the 2nd of the senior researchers on the project. Unfortunately, she's had to be at another event today, although I think it's a related event, which will be really good for us to be represented at. The project is based in the Literacy Research Centre at Lancaster University, which brings together the Departments of Linguistics and Educational Research. So we have the benefit of both of those scholarly traditions, if you like, in our project. Okay, so the 4 of us are going to present during this seminar, and we're going to divide up into different sections. I'm going to start off with something about the background and description of the project. We're then going to give you 2 extended examples from our data that you can kind of get your teeth into, and we're going to then have a final section about the international implications of the project, some of the links that we've made and some of the collaborations that we hope might develop from it. Okay, so I'm aware that this is probably an audience mainly of people who are concerned with educational research, who may not have thought too much about the language aspects of change in higher education. So here's the first question: why study writing in higher education? And our argument here is to do with the idea that writing work is at the heart of knowledge production. In many cultures that's the case, but traditionally, particularly here in the UK, but in many other places as well, the university has been a pivotal and a very highly valued site for this kind of work, this kind of knowledge work. What we would argue is that the current transformations in the higher education workplace lead to changes in the work, responsibilities and identities of academics, which can be tracked through their writing practices. So it's as if we're opening a window, if you like, onto change through the lens of the writing work that academics do. So that's our argument. So how are universities changing? Because that's part of the kind of rationale and significance of our project. And what might the implications for academics' work be? Now, we've kind of been changing these ideas, kind of trying to refine the way we express them as the project's developed. There's lots and lots of different ways of doing it. You've probably rehearsed them yourselves, but I just run through the ways that we're thinking about this. So, as a kind of basic premise, we would say that universities are changing within the context of an international, competitive, knowledge-based economy. And from these changes and from this positioning of higher education, new versions of knowledge emerge. And this is around new producers and new audiences for higher education. I don't think any of this is new or controversial, but it's stating a kind of basic understanding that we have in the project. So, to get more specific, what does this involve? It involves changing bodies of students. So, in the UK particularly, this involves massification, widening participation, the change from an elite to a mass system of higher education. It involves the internationalisation of the student body. And this is not just in terms of people coming to the UK, but also the development of dispersed international campuses. So Lancaster, for example, now has as many students in its overseas campuses as you would see walking around our campus university here. And this is a really big change that in some ways can be quite invisible to people on the ground day to day. And then the final change here, again particularly in the UK but not uniquely to it, is the consumerisation and marketisation of higher education, which changes relationships with students. And the issue of student fees, for example, is a really live one, and again, not just here, but in other countries, as we'll go on to see later on. More changes. Transformations in managerial practices in universities. Again, this will be very familiar to people. There may be different ways in which you express this or understand it. Accountability practices and auditing. Here in England, this is particularly to do with the REF and the upcoming teaching excellence framework, whatever that brings. But it also entails a whole lot of smaller, more everyday practices of accountability and audits that people are subject to in their work. And these are then assembled in different ways to move towards these big accountability exercises. Also the intensification of work and increasing job flexibility and for many people insecurity of their jobs as well. These are changes that academics have experienced and talked to us about. Changing resources, this is a big category. Particularly we focused on new digital tools. It's impossible to avoid that when you talk to people about their work and how it's changing. And this involves working with changed times and spaces of work. For example, we do, particularly in this department, for example, much in the way of distance and blended learning now. Again, our students are all over the world. And we have the possibility of many kinds of collaboration and video conferencing, which we have today. The changing nature of scholarship, this is beginning to be documented. And particularly, we would point out here the changing nature of digital scholarship, the use of different kinds of resources. So, apart from the historians that we interviewed, I think most people have moved very significantly towards online repositories and resources for their work. So it's moving away from paper, away from the books on the shelves to digital information, and that changes the nature of scholarship. And then finally here, mobilities. There are new possibilities for moving around, working in different places, again, changing time and space for the work that academics do. Okay, so these changes in the demands and resources of the academic workplace, we would argue, lead to tensions and pressures, which we have picked up in our project. So just to say some examples of these, pressures to publish in a strategic way, which can conflict with traditional norms of disciplinary practice and the established routines that academics have, different timescales and types of outputs. Pressures to be accountable to standards which may change the nature of academic work, and having to respond to new demands around impact, engagement and open access. This is both publishing and more generally in terms of interaction and communication, and particularly pressures to engage in social media, maintain public online persona, which is a very big change for some people, and finally the use of new technological platforms, for example virtual learning environments, but also collaborative tools. For example, if you're trying to collaborate with other scholars across the world, you need to do that often through different digital platforms, and that involves some learning and kind of responses to different cultures, different academic cultures that people are involved with. So there's lots there. I wanted to say something about the theoretical perspectives that inform what we're doing. We share a long-standing theoretical approach to literacy as part of social practice. And I know that this might be an unfamiliar one for some people, but it's about researching what people are doing with reading and writing, however you want to define that. Not what they should be doing or what skills they should have, but actually looking at people's practices from day to day, what they're doing. We also take in this project a socio-material perspective, which is very compatible with the literacy practices approach, which puts into attention how people's writing practices are shaped by social and material tools and contexts and resources, including the digital resources that I've been talking about. So this is something that really, it is about shifting attention almost to widen the focus really on what's doing. We're not just looking at texts that are produced by people, but we're looking at the conditions under which those texts are produced and how people do it. So just as some examples of the concepts from these approaches that would guide our research and that we think illuminate the dynamics of knowledge creation. So one concept is the idea of textual trajectories, which again moves us from specific instances of what people are doing with text to looking at the sequences of activity that people engage in with their reading and writing, and how texts travel through the institutional life of academics. Dorothy Smith talks about this as the life of text in institutional ordering, how texts actually do things for us, help us coordinate action. The second concept of inscription actually comes from the socio-material approach, although there are literacy theorists as well who have picked up the idea of inscription. And again, this is the idea that knowledge is inscribed within the texts and documents that we use and produce. And the social relationships, the purposes of those texts are marked, they're coded in the text. And therefore, those texts actually can have material effects. They can act as social actors, if you like. And in that way, they help to move forward intellectual and practical projects. So this, I'm trying to kind of argue here for this very strong link between writing texts, the things that people are doing with those texts, and social action, actual real effects on knowledge and institutional life. Inscription as well is a nice term because it's not just about words, but for example it could be encoding through numbers, which is a very important aspect of the kind of work, the writing work that people do in academia these days and in many other contexts as well. So a couple more. The idea of symmetry, which again is from socio-material theory, makes us attend equally to material, affective and social aspects of writing practices. This is quite important because it means that we treat all writing as real and important and as contributing to the development of knowledge creation. When you start talking to people about the writing they do, they'll tell you about the real writing that they do and all the other writing that actually they wish in some cases they didn't do, or is kind of less real in some way. For us it's all real, and we have to treat it equally as researchers. And finally, the idea of mundane materiality, which is asserting the importance of everyday activities, everyday conditions in which people work. That, again, the things that people often dismiss or don't notice or look through, but to us, those are the kind of materials in which we deal in our project. Okay, so I just wanted to say something about the research design that we've used. That's the kind of background framing of it. What we've done is select 3 universities and 3 different disciplines as examples of the work that we want to look at. We chose these incredibly rationally, originally, and then when you actually try and turn them into the practice of a research project, you find them kind of slipping between your fingers. So we have the University A, which we now describe as a research-intensive 1960s campus university. And the fact that the university is based in a constrained campus is very different from, for example, University B, which is in an urban setting, but it has much more dispersed buildings, and University C, which is a red brick research-intensive metropolitan-based university, where, again, you know, the sense of campus has to be created in a different way. And you've got different sizes of university, you've got different student populations. There's many, many ways in which the universities we've looked at differ, even though we chose them for these particular characteristics. We chose maths, marketing and history to represent the more STEM side of disciplinary work, marketing as an applied discipline, and history as an art social science discipline. But they kind of can only represent one bit of that whole spectrum. And up until now, we've done 62 interviews. I'll explain how those have been done. We expect to have worked with about 100 people by the end of our project, which is academics, but also some administrative and technical staff who work with those academics. Okay, so this is actually what we've done. We've had 3 phases to our project. Phase 1 is working with individuals, and we've done 3 interviews with each person. We do what we call a walkabout interview with our selected academics. We do a technobiography looking at the history of their involvement with technology and writing. And we do another interview where we go through a typical day's practice with them around writing. In phase 2, we wanted to do some kind of observation of what people are doing in terms of writing. So we have been recording, where people have allowed us to do this, the detail of what they're doing at their computers. They select a document to write on, and we use some technology that you can put on people's computers in order to track their keystrokes and what they're doing on the screen. And we also interview them about that and ask them, in some cases, to kind of talk us through what they're doing. Some people feel more comfortable about that than others. And then we're still in the process of our phase 3 interview at the moment, which is understanding the community, we've said. So this is how the work of an individual academic actually fits into the wider context within which they're working, whether that's a department or a research centre, and the particular university context that they work within, and the people they collaborate with. We've also been, the advantage of studying the place places where we work, the site where we work, is that we can actually test out some of the instruments that we've been using in the project ourselves, and we have a whole strand that we've called an autoethnography running along here. We've piloted our interviews, we've tried out what it's like to have your writing recorded on screen and have to talk through that process. So we've got interviews with ourselves as well, and we also piloted on a number of our colleagues, as Paul mentioned. So we've been in quite a lot to kind of round out the interview and the observational data that we've been collecting. Okay, and just to show you the kind of observational data that we get from our phase 2, this is a screenshot which is deliberately blurred so that you can't actually read the emails and things that people are looking at. But you can see here, this is somebody working on their computer, and one of the things that you can see is that they've got a number of things open on their screen, and this is a very typical thing that happens when people are writing. That you're kind of either multitasking or you've got things going on in the background that are kind of impinging on your attention, if you like. And this kind of multitasking and the interruptions that happen when people are writing is one aspect that we're very interested in. And this is my final slide, and I just wanted to give you an idea before we go into the specific examples of the distribution of writing activity that we have been told about in our interviews with people. We've got something like, I think, 64 different types of writing coded, and particularly on the research side, we have like a massive number of outputs that people talk to us about that they have been involved with. Most people's job descriptions include 3 of these 4 categories here. They include teaching, research, and administration. Often those are kind of pinned down through workload models. You know, a particular percentage of your job is supposed to be spent doing these things. As an example of teaching, course proposals, handouts, lecture notes, feedback to students has a massive role in what people do. Writing exams. Research, before, during and after projects, you're involved in writing activities. Application forms, ethics, communication with your participants, producing articles, books, videos, media articles, even poems people have talked about. Administration we divided into personal and professional. So on the personal side, people have to write expenses claims, to-do lists, applications for fellowships, and so on. On the professional side, they write agendas, they write their inputs for ref documents, they write letters, budgets, comments on student applications, examiners, reports, and so on. And the 4th category here as well, you could say, is a more optional category that we've called service, which is more external related activities. Optional, but often very highly valued because it's the way that you contribute to your professional community beyond the institution itself. So book reviews, writing references, doing external examining, being a guest speaker, and so on, or a member of a significant committee, perhaps. Okay, so I hope that I've given you an idea of what we've done that is okay. Have we got time for a couple of questions of clarification, or should we move on, do you think?
Very quick.
Very quick, yeah.
We've had half an hour.
Have I? Right, okay.
With the intro. Are there any questions of clarification?
Perhaps we should count.
I think we're carry on.
Okay.
Okay, so that gives you an idea of the project as a whole. Ibrar and I are going to talk about some specific examples to kind of show you the kinds of things that we've been looking at in more detail. And the first one we've called Mobilising Research Networks in the Accelerated Academy. This is a representation of the processes involved in producing one particular text. So through the interviews that we've been doing, people have been talking to us about specific texts that they're involved in working on. And I'm going to talk through this one text trajectory step by step. This represents the writing of a collaborative EU grant proposal, which one of our participants was involved with. And she talked us through the different stages in the process, and this focuses on the people who were involved and also the digital tools and platforms that were used to communicate and collaborate with those people. And I'm going to be arguing that the dynamics of this particular example illustrate some of the things that Mary's spoken about already, and some of the kind of broader findings that are emerging from our project in relation to things like new kinds of patterns of collaboration and coordination, the importance of engaging with digital tools and platforms for writing and enrolling people into new kinds of networks, and it's also a nice illustration of what we can call the acceleration of the academy. So this example came from Diane, who is a senior academic in the area of marketing. And Diane was contacted by a group of scientists who were producing a tool that could be used in an industry to reduce the environmental impact of that industry. And they had begun the process of putting together a bid to research the use of this tool and the capacity for this tool to transform the industry. They'd been working on this idea for a while, and they were now at the point of putting together what was a fairly large bid, and they'd realised they needed to enrol a specialist in her particular area of marketing for one of the chunks of the bid, one of the work packages they were putting together. So they initially emailed her. They emailed her with a kind of initial feeler email and then sent her the proposal to look at. She was interested enough, having read through the proposal, to have a couple of discussions with them using Skype. They were based in a European country, they weren't based in the UK. And she agreed to be involved in the project in principle. This required the completion of a variety of different forms, which were emailed to her as attachments. She filled in the forms, and at this point she was a member of the bid team. But she still felt she didn't really have a good understanding of the project, and particularly of where she was going to fit in the project. So you can see here that these were people that she didn't work with on a habitual basis, but they were able to locate her easily, contact her quickly, enrol her into the process quickly using the digital tools that were available to them easily. The next step was for Diane to get on a plane and go to Europe for a 3-day meeting. The bid was for £10 million. There were 13 universities involved in the bid across 6 different countries, and there were representatives from all of these 13 universities in a room together for this 3-day meeting. The plan was that these 13 or more people would get together in rooms, sit down for 3 days, come out with a written bid. Didn't quite work out that way. It turns out that the process of inscription that Mary was talking about is not a completely straightforward one, because this was not the ideal conditions for writing. Diane explained to us that, well, we tried to write things when we were together, but we got too tired. These are academics that are used to crafting. You do your wordsmithing right at the end, and sometimes if you try to wordsmith too early, you can't capture it. It actually slows you down. You have to be able to stand back and look at your own words as if a stranger has written them, and that didn't work. But what did work was, by being in the same room together, the affordances of face-to-face communication are different from the affordances even of Skype. And it did allow a back-and-forth discussion where Diane and her new colleagues were able to thrash out things like terminological issues. So this is an interdisciplinary bid. She discovered that they were using the same words to mean entirely different things, and by being physically present, they were able to come to agreements about the kinds of language they were using, where they agreed, where they didn't agree. And she felt that this face-to-face moment in the process of collaborative writing was absolutely crucial for gaining that understanding, because without it, she says, Skype and email conversations are misunderstood, especially when it's interdisciplinary. While they were not able to write the bid itself, what they were able to do, as a result of these conversations, was put together a skeleton using Word, bullet points, going through all the pieces of the bid that were required, and using the comments function of Word to say who was going to write which bit. So we can see here the affordances of this digital platform being used to coordinate a division of labour between this big, diverse team. Everyone goes away with the same reification that they work through. Everyone knows where exactly their part in this writing process belongs. So Diane said she came away going, okay, now I know what we need to do. And after the meeting, she was much, much clearer about what her bit was. She was leading the marketing work package. There were 2 other marketing academics involved. So her first piece of writing was not collaborative. She wrote a one-pager on her own to outline her contribution, circulated it to the other members of the marketing team. So now we're down to a team of 3. These 3 people then needed to write the marketing work package. They were using Word. They started off using the track changes capacity in Word to monitor who was changing what. This didn't work for a very simple reason. These very simple things can often be quite crucial in collaborative writing, because the colours of the track changes were different on different computers. So when they were Skyping and screen sharing, they couldn't talk about the yellow bit or the red bit because they'd all changed colour. So they leveraged a different affordance of Word. They agreed on colours of highlighting, and they each highlighted changes that they made, which sounds a bit clunkier, but it was fixed, and it enabled them to produce this shared document. So Diane was doing an overview of the industrial system. There was somebody else working on consumption practices, somebody else working on barriers to introducing sustainability. So this combination of circulating versions by Word and Skype enabled them to produce their bit of the work packages. So the multimodal affordances are crucial here. IT becomes crucial at this point. The next phase was to coordinate their work package with the larger bid team. So there were 5 work packages, one on biology, one on chemistry, one on the fieldwork to test the tool out, and there was one on communications which explained how all of these different chunks of the bid would fit together. And that was coordinated by the scientists who'd invited her in the first place. And at the same time as the different teams were producing each of these documents, a range of other documents were being produced from the centre: budgets, ethical statements, impact plans, all of the kinds of documents which support the bid, supported by administrative and technical staff. How long would you say this took? Any guesses? 3 months?
9 months.
No. Anyone else? Anyone's been involved in these enormous EU bids? Okay, I'm going to tell you. That first contact was on the first day of month A. The meeting was on the 20th day of month A, and the bid was submitted on the 11th day of month B, the following month. Okay. All those written communications involved in producing the final versions of the bid after the meeting had to take place in about 20 days. Including weekends. Now, this wasn't from scratch. There were teams involved in the first steps before Diane got involved, but her involvement was pretty quick. And pretty disruptive as well. So somebody comes in and says, do you want to be involved in a £10 million bid? Yes, that would be great. But this is going to involve a very intensive amount of collaborative written work over a very squeezed period of time. They got it in there, they got it in by the deadline. So this example shows various things. It shows how the internationalised academy depends on a range of different writing practices. It depends on mastering a range of digital platforms, being able to use them in flexible ways, in different ways, depending on what you're doing, whether you're doing planning, division of labour, wordsmithing and crafting. The broader context is working in a research-intensive university. Diane was under enormous strategic pressure to be involved in big international bids. So this wasn't something that she could turn down. This was something that was important to her department, for her career. You can see how the interdisciplinarity of the academy, it transforms what can be done in terms of bringing together marketers, chemists, biologists, other kinds of scientists to produce a tool, but also introduces the need for specific work around things like terminology. You can see how access to a shared range of digital technologies, and it's important that these were shared across the different countries as well, that everybody was using Skype, everybody was using Microsoft Office, which wasn't necessarily the case 10, 15 years ago. It supports the division of labour in writing, it enables the coordination of tasks, it enables this back and forth between face-to-face and distance, but it also enables this enormously accelerated process. You can also argue that it makes this, once this accelerated process becomes possible, then does it become mandatory? Does it become expected? Does it change the ways in which we go about doing this academic work? The other thing which digital technologies enabled, it enabled Diane to do all her usual writing, keeping up with emails, keeping up with student emails, emails from the department, those kinds of things, while she was away at a very short notice, disruptive 3-day international meeting. It shows the importance of becoming able to be enrolled quickly into these kinds of international networks, working out how to do collaborative writing in these networks with people you may not have worked with before, and the importance of mastering different kinds of writing practices at different points in the process. We think a lot of these are fairly new kinds of practices, and those academics who can acquire them at speed are at a strategic advantage, but possibly also at the risk of being faced with a great deal more accelerated work. Are there any quick questions or responses? We'll have the chance to discuss at more length at the end of the presentation. Does it sound familiar? Okay. I was going to take a different kind of example now.
Thank you. So, yeah, consistent with our interest in academics writing through a literacy studies approach, we were led to look at how texts and documents and literacy practices are embedded in particular contexts, that they have histories, and they're attached to communities and disciplines. So, this is especially evident in contemporary higher education, where new strands of activity, each with their own different and sometimes conflicting value systems, can be brought together. Academics working in higher education now have a growing number of genres and text types to contend with. Think of the academic who writes a paper, and that has a particular set of conventions attached to it. Then they write an abstract for that paper, which has its own conventions and a wider audience. Then they write a blog post or an article in the conversation about that research. Again, the same research, but a different set of social practices and audience around that. Then they might write a tweet about that blog post or that article, and then they write an email to their colleagues alerting them to the tweet that they just wrote, asking them to politely retweet it. So there's a multiple accretion of textual work. For every text, there can be other forms of writing tasks attached to it to augment it. And now you get lots of different workshops and training sessions about how to be proficient in all these forms of writing, how to write journal articles, how to write abstracts, how to use Twitter, how to write blog posts, and how to do anything else. So, there's a new layer of work with each brings a set of challenges, just as we saw with Diane. So this is something that we found in our project, and I'd like to illustrate it with one example that we might like to call new forms of work or new genres. And it comes from a historian that I observed called Don. That's a pseudonym, by the way. So it's just one example of the new forms of writing that we've seen emerge in the work of academics. So when I came to see Don to talk to him about all the writing he'd done in a particular day, which was one of our research methods, he told me he was working on a report which is based on the examiner's report of the learning and teaching provision. I'll just go to that now, sorry. Right. It was a report that was meant to be put on the VLE for students to access and read, and one that was specifically meant for students to read. He had been asked by his head of department to write a version of the report in a way that spoke to the needs of students and the interests of the new cohort of students. And this report was to be decidedly different to the actual examiner's report, which exists and has always existed primarily for staff and departmental purposes. So this was a report in response to the changing relationship with students, and one which was meant to reassure them that their needs were being met and that the department are taking seriously areas where they need to improve in their, quote, delivery of the programs to them. It's important to think about what goes into an examiner's report. A whole chain of events and texts feed into it, as with the example of Diane earlier. A pile of text and documentation meant for the examiner in order to make their assessment, meetings, and also the legal aspects feed into this, and other things like student feedback data. And importantly, this is also on behalf of the head of department. Don has been instructed to undertake this task of writing a distillation of a set of evaluations made about the department. And another question to ask is, who's the audience? Who's going to be reading it? Don talked about how he was foregrounding aspects of the report to suit a newly arrived student audience. And this is the first time that a report of this kind is being written for his students, pointing to a more empowered student group being catered for, and a new kind of writing work on the part of academics like Don. Perhaps a need for greater accountability and transparency in the learning and teaching process. We shouldn't be surprised if those students' parents and families are reading that report over dinner, discussing what's happening at university. They're an increasing presence in open days now in universities as well. So the actors that influence new kinds of writing are far removed from the actors within the institution, and that's one of the things that we've found. New kinds of writing that Don must contend with different values attached to it, among the many and new and sometimes small changes that he has to contend with, and the new strands of activity that are accreted to universities, and different writing tasks added to Don's workload. The document is a recontextualization of an established genre for a new stakeholder or audience. Here, a text trajectory is about being dependent on previous texts which link to it in a chain of writing activities continuously added to Don's workload, as we saw with Diane earlier, and also with the hypothetical example I gave about an academic who tweets an abstract to an article which is about something else, which is based on something else. And another thing to bear in mind here is that he was asked to disseminate this to the students via the VLE, or the virtual learning environment. Digitisation facilitates not the rapid dissemination of text, but also the rapid production of new texts. Had there been no Moodle in which Don could upload this and other documents, then he may have had to do things differently. Maybe post a copy to each student's pigeonhole, or maybe to their home addresses. My guess is he may not have had to do it at all. The thing with digitisation, and this includes the switch to email as the default mode of communication, is that it allows for the acceleration of work, both in terms of speed and quantity, and more texts get funneled into the VLE. A kind of, if it can be done, it should be done approach. And so Don's example is useful, albeit slightly briefer than Diane's on both these accounts. So does this sound familiar, and what are the implications for academic work? You're welcome to comment now, or also at the end as well.
Then I'll move on. Okay, to bring things together and turn to international dimensions of the research, first a sort of anecdote. So far we've presented our work in 9 different countries. I'm not quite sure how we've done that, since we were funded to go to 1 international conference each. But we've been as far away as the US and Hong Kong and Germany, Austria, Ireland, Spain, Sweden. When giving papers, afterwards people come rushing up to us and say, oh, giving us their condolences about what's going on in England, or saying, yes, it's just as tough here, or things like that. People have always got something to say of their relationship to it, and wanting. We always feel that, you know, when we chat with people, like last night there was a reception for the 8 Scandinavians who were visiting. You start asking them, and then we're collecting more data. They're telling us all sorts of things that they're finding. And it occurs, if the papers we've given in the UK, there's always an international audience, in the sense of people who've worked abroad for a while, have recently come back from a conference, those sort of things. If you remember the volcanic thing in Scandinavia, when there was all this dust and things, the number of academics who weren't at their desks, you know, and each department was checking the people who were that minute all over the world, or just got back, or in our department stuck in Nigeria, I think, and me stuck in Stavanger, which is memorable. Okay, this demonstrates the internationalness of universities, and we want to emphasise the internationalness of universities and academic life, I think, more than many other jobs. Part of the things we've been finding is how weird as a job being an academic is, in all sorts of ways, of what you don't have control over, than other aspects of life that you do have strong control over it. And academics move around jobs internationally, and crucially, a part of global networks, and there's a lot of academic mobility. I want to offer a term coming from sociolinguistics and migration studies, that this pattern of complexity of movement and language use is referred to as superdiversity. We live in a super diverse, thank you, we live in a super diverse world. What can the project offer internationally to these people we meet at conferences? We're keeping to England. We're keeping to a narrow range of disciplines. What we see we're doing, take a term from ethnography, I think, a telling case which can be used as a point of comparison. We're trying to in detail describe particular events and practices and movement across practices. So we have a telling case, and we bring methodologies, our data collection instruments, the way we've used technobiographies, we're documenting that well, so that others can use that. There we are. There we are, sorry. So the instruments, we've got quite well worked out instruments and approaches to analysis that we're working out. And we are actually finding that people, we're talking in various different countries about some sorts of, I don't want to quite say comparisons, but people providing their own cases. So that's the sort of direction we want to go in. In terms of the international dimensions, firstly, there are all the social issues. We've talked right at the beginning about massification in England, how that's working out, internationalization and managerial practices, how those sort of things are working out. And each country tells a different story. There's a lot of international contact at the highest level, and we think some countries are following other countries and that sort of thing, and we know about the OECD. We can't always work out how it's happening, but how those all work out in different places. We're technology rich. We saw that in the example of working internationally. Not everywhere has that. The north-south disparities, including access to technology. So whether you have a virtual learning environment, whether you have electricity on all the time, whether there's any way in which your library resources have been all put online, which can be absolutely fantastic, but if you've got no electricity, that makes a difference. A lot of what people are doing are bringing in their own experiences, their own technologies, their own phones, and using them in the workplace. So there's a lot that people are bringing, resources people are bringing from their everyday life into academic life. This doesn't happen everywhere. The available of portable devices, smartphones, the tools we've talked about. And then there's this thing about being part of global networks. We've got one example. It's partly cultural, but there is disruption and uncertainty, and people vary in the extent to what networks they're part of, and this issue of mobility. As a linguist, I want to focus on the socio-linguistic question, what linguistics is usually up to, who speaks what to whom, and in what language. If you think of a particular situation that you may know, Sweden, Hong Kong, South Africa, Spain, all very different. And in terms of language use, and often thinking about the role of English for an academic in Hong Kong, the language of school education can be English, it can be Cantonese and Mandarin. The language of teaching at HE, there's a lot of English going on in specific courses at specific levels. Different disciplines have more or less allowances of different languages. The crucial one, the language of publishing. The language of everyday life. Lancaster maybe have all its, well, it doesn't have all its courses taught in English, but has a lot of them. Individual students from specific countries who are talking through a project they're doing might be using their home languages. So within teaching and learning, or getting advice from friends. But then on the other hand, the language of social media coming into the workplace tends to be English. So as well as super diversity, we're working with super diverse academics. And the big issue around language is publishing in English, and to cut straight to it, people wanting to know why they get rejected and what other rejections do. The simplistic answer is, oh well, the English isn't good enough. But there's lots of other things going on, things about beyond getting through the rejections, there are things which may be just as important about what networks you're in or networks you're not in. There's a host of other things going on there. And that's the thing about publishing in English is quite a well-researched topic. And I'm talking about it in terms of English, but let's just sort of turn it around, not talk about English, but talk about the good things about knowing other languages. That a multilingual scholar may be publishing, someone in Sweden may be publishing in German as well as publishing in English, and have pressure to publish in Swedish. And to see the experiences of the multilingual scholar, I think, is a good way of getting away from being totally English-centered. So there's all these things floating around, and the steps we wanted to do next is to move on to think about the international context for what we've been doing. And is there a final goodbye? Oh yes, so that's the end of the talk. Thank you very much, and we're in good time.
Thank you. Please help yourself to refreshments, should you want some more. But I think we'll move straight into questions and discussions. For people who are joining us via the link, just to remind you that the email address to send emails to if you have questions or comments is edreseminars@lancaster.ac.uk with a double S in the middle.
We have a hashtag as well.
Yeah, good. I forgot to mention what. Can you say what the hashtag is?
Acad's writing.
All lowercase.
Well, yeah. Acad's writing.
They are.
Okay, so there are all the ways, the super diverse ways you can get in contact and ask a question, but if we start with people in the room for questions.
Can I start with something which is a different end really from David's conclusion, which is more kind of local. In the design, as I remember it, you were comparing two research-intensive universities, one campus, one non-campus based. I was just wondering whether you pick up any differences that are to do with the kind of physical aspects of the university. Because it seems to me that one of the implications of a lot of what you're talking about is most of those just rapidly disappear. And it's got a lot more to do with the culture. So being research-intensive would be important. If you're in a teaching-intensive university, suddenly going off for 3 days on a workshop would not be possible. So you have those sort of things to be done. But given you've got that, does it matter anymore where you are, what the university looks like?
I think it does, because as well as those ways in which you depart from your immediate environment, people still do spend quite a lot of time in, kind of in mundane ways in their immediate local the size of the offices people have, their proximity to their colleagues or to the students that they teach varies a great deal, and some universities are much poorer than others. Some are much more dispersed than others in terms of the facilities that they have. Even something like where the printer is located, where you're going to print your documents out, might be just down the corridor. It might be a mile away, in another building. I mean, that actually is true in one of the places that we've been researching. So I think the actual, those immediate physical spaces that people are in still does have impinge on their quality of life and their satisfaction in the work that they do. Do you want to say anything else about that?
In terms of space, we certainly found people would use different spaces for different kinds of writing quite often, and I think I expected to find more differences between the urban and the campus universities than I did. But I think one of the things is about the relationship between home and work. And how easy it is to travel between those, to be able to use those spaces for different kinds of writing. That's different for people in a campus university who live close, in a campus university who live a long way away, or in an urban site where very few people live very close to the university. So I think that's one of the changes, one of the influences that we found.
Thanks for very interesting presentation and project, and I think the research methods are really impressive and really helpful, I think, for all of us. I've got some comments about the underlying narrative, and that's what I want to try and open up. I mean, we tell this story quite a lot, about how our performance-driven political economy and higher education could create certain constraints and shapes us in certain positive ways. And I think technology story is an important part of that story we tell. And it's interesting, isn't it, because the technology is common to everyone, but differentiated in its resources and so on, so that some people have better access to it than others. But the political economy story, the story about managerialism and funding and competition and so on, does vary considerably from country to country. So you do have that interesting variation. But both those stories are about external determination of academic work. And academic work has a lot of autonomy and a long history, to make a very late Foucauldian point, about practices of the self that create for academics spaces of freedom. And which sort of brings me to think that knowledge content is underplayed in the project. I think there's probably a lot of data there, that in relation to different disciplines, for example, and we talked about international diversity, which is a very useful point, but that's about external determinations. And I'd say you probably could find a pretty rich disciplinary diversity as well. We know that from long study of higher education, going back to Tony Beecher, that late 80s, that people vary more in relation to disciplinary identity than they on things like values and practices than they do in any other way, whether it's gender or age or anything else. Disciplines really are shaping and important. Do people create practices of themselves continually in the discipline? So while you've got all this stuff with technology and the political economy going on, you've also got autonomous development of disciplines going on in worldwide networks, and that can change the content and perhaps also the writing practices as well. And that's what I'm not sure about, because you've talked about the writing practices as if they're all one generic group of practices. I just wonder whether again, disciplinary differentiation or variation, diversity might create different notions of writing practice as well.
Yeah, I can speak a bit to that. Absolutely, we found that the different disciplines we've worked with are associated with very different writing practices. That interplays with things about the institution, particularly the differences between teaching-intensive and research-intensive institutions, where I think certainly our teaching-intensive institution has there's less of that autonomy you were talking about. So that's the first thing. What we found is that our historians and our pure mathematicians in particular gave us accounts of particular kinds of writing practices that defined the disciplines. It didn't mean they were all doing it, so not all of our historians were going off into archives, spending weeks and weeks going through original source material and then spending years to write a monograph, but that was the tale that they told us of this is what historians do. And the ones who didn't actually do that said, well, there are people who say I'm not a proper historian, I claim to be a historian, because they kind of negotiated their relationship to the discipline. And similarly, the pure mathematicians talked about, when we're interested in the physicality of the practice, just scribbling for a long time to figure out the steps of lemmas and proofs, and then writing. So there was
physically writing on blackboard.
Physically writing on blackboards is very important for teaching, especially. And in the more applied disciplines, for the applied mathematicians and the marketing academics, there was more diversity of writing practices, so they weren't associated with kind of a single defining writing practice, but there was diversity in different ways. So yes, diversity. That meant that when people did talk about these overarching trends, the managerialism, the accountability, they played out in different ways in those different disciplines. So many of the historians felt, for instance, that the monograph was under a pressure that other disciplines that habitually published in journal articles more were not under the same pressure. I mean, you've heard these conversations before. Whereas the marketers didn't feel that kind of pressure because they were writing journal articles anyway, but they felt under an enormous amount of pressure to publish in the right journals that the Chartered Association of Business Schools had in their list. So yeah, we are definitely looking at those disciplinary differences within the project as a whole. We haven't talked about it very much here, but you're absolutely right. They're crucial in understanding what's going on.
Just before I'll say just to follow up on Simon's question a little bit, to what extent, because in a way, my understanding of Simon's question is there a single narrative, or is the narrative different in different disciplines? And your response is, oh, well, they're different, seem to be the different versions of the same narrative. Is that your position, or do the narratives actually have a different shape and meaning?
Okay, I can tell you my version of that, but the others might have. I would adopt kind of a social realist perspective on that, in that there are certain constraints and certain trends which you can identify as being common across academia in England. There are pressures to do with centralised things like the REF, which play out differently in different institutions depending on their strategic priorities, but you can locate back to a kind of common origin. There are also things which are specific to particular disciplines, particular kinds of institutions. So once you get and particular departments, and so as you know, we've talked to heads of departments to say, how are you mediating the messages that are coming from the university and above in relation to your particular set of staff. So there are overarching trends. They play out differently at all the different levels. To come to a particular set of possibilities and constraints that the individual academic is facing, the individual academic's response to those constraints is, again, there is agency there, clearly. They get to choose to a greater or lesser extent depending on where they are. So not a single narrative, but some things which are common across. But you have to nuance the level at which it plays out.
At one point we took whole group of academics from the 3 different disciplines off for a 2-day retreat in a nice hotel nearby, which was a lot of fun. And the mathematicians and historians and management people immediately bonded with each other. There were things they had in common. The thing that everyone has in common is email, and how they can't stand it and they hate it and they leave their phone on all night, and the first thing they look at in the morning. Everyone's got the same story. So they did bond around a lot of things happening. But as you're saying, at the other side, when to decide between sciences, what science can we take to study, there isn't a typical one, and that hadn't really sort of struck us. We thought that was all going to be much, much easier. Same with social sciences things. We should have taken some lab thing, physics or chemistry, where they're doing chemicals and making strange smells in test tubes and things like that. But for some reason, Karin persuaded us to look at maths, and before we started, we had no idea. I wonder what a maths article's like. Didn't have a clue. You know, is it all those numbers? You know, and they use they use Word as well as LaTeX. They have their own equivalent to a word processing package, which they all know, use, and share, which is full of equations. But you know, they do write as well.
And they use loads of metaphors. That's what because we have a reading group in the project that goes alongside, and we've been trying to read some articles that it's been difficult to actually comprehend at some level, but you can kind of pick up the format of it. And the thing that amazed me about the maths article we looked at was the number of metaphorical kind of dimensions to it, if you like.
We have a lovely stretch of an interview from one of our pure mathematicians who talks about writing with his PhD students. He says the PhD students will come in and they've done all the maths, but then they need to be able to tell the story. And the way he described supporting the PhD students in their writing of the story was very similar to the way people that we spoke to in social sciences and humanities talked about writing the story, pulling out the narrative, crafting, wordsmithing.
Yeah, one of the questions in our interview technique is to ask, to what extent do you get to choose what you write about? And another one is, where do you see yourself in your discipline? And I think that I haven't seen personally one type of answer come out of those questions that I've asked the participants. Some, for example, will describe themselves and their relationships, their discipline differently depending on the kinds of writing activities that they're proficient in and the kinds of forums that they enjoy writing in. Like somebody who's a historian who's started experimenting with Twitter has had his work promoted in the internet, and sociologists have now picked up his work. So now he says, I'm a historian whose work gets used by sociologists. So that when you said about the digital space and the sort of and the disciplinary networks there, that kind of reminded me of that. So I think there's something to be a line of argument to be drawn out from the project based on your question. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting project. I really enjoyed that. I particularly liked this approach of textual trajectories, and I'm just wondering, it's not, in my opinion, just about the production of knowledge leading to the textual artifact, but also what happens with them afterwards. So I'm thinking social life of things, Apadorai kind of work, and so on. If this is changing as well, so what happens with texts after they are produced? And if social practices are changing, how does then this affect back to the academic practices and academic labor as well? So, I mean, not necessarily that you include that in your project, but it would just be good to think about.
Yeah, I think Ibrar's hypothetical example of that chaining link between the abstract, the tweet, the retweet, the way in which the texts that academics produce can become embedded into this immediate, wide-ranging network discussion where they get picked up in unpredictable ways is interesting.
And it does have effects on the work that people do, what they prioritise, and also the way that they feel about themselves as an academic. And I mean, one of the things about social media is how public that is, and how that goes, you know, against a tradition of kind of perhaps more private, considered writing work that you don't reveal until the very last draft of it. So that has an effect on who you are, what kind of academic you are, and are you a popularizer or are you still kind of a more traditional scholar? Those kind of issues feed back.
No, you just about me when she said popularizer.
Well, you suddenly stuck your head in, so I thought you might be about to ask a question.
I just, cold word thing.
But this is another one of those examples where there is also a kind of central imperative with the impact agenda filtering down through university strategy to encourage people to engage in a wider range of communications about their academic work. and we have in our data people respond to that in very different ways. We have a great quote: "I have an absolute, total, and utter aversion to social media in any form." From people, all the way from that to people who are actively keeping blogs and tweeting about their research. All these are new kinds of ways of engaging and ways of, as you say, the life of a particular text being taken up in new spaces.
We think particularly with the social media we've caught a very interesting moment, because there are some people who are absolutely not doing it and not keen to, and other people who are doing it all the time. So I'm sure that's changing almost by the day.
And universities are changing their attitude to it, of having absolutely no interest in it, to having whole departmental policies on tweeting.
I mean, one of our final research question is to what extent are changes in writing practices changing academics' professional identities? And social media is a very good example of that. We have somebody said to us that I want to be known for my work. I don't want to be known for myself as an individual. It's my work that I want to be known for. Inevitably, the way in which social media is structured, you become known for yourself as an individual as well as for your work. Now, some people are more or less comfortable with that, and that isn't necessarily associated with a traditional academic professional identity. It's not most of them.
Yeah, I was thinking about what David said about multilingualism. But to what extent does multilingualism come up in the UK context with the researchers that you looked at? Because I'm doing research on academic writing practices in the Finnish context, and they're basically at least reading and writing in at least two languages is something that almost all researchers do. So I'm wondering how that plays in the context that you looked at.
Well, in the linguistics department, I think is it just over half academics are overseas, and I don't think we ever talk about what they do. We never thought of asking them, do you publish in other languages? But as soon as we thought about it, we suddenly realised that they do. Yeah. I say they, since the two of us here are not multilingual scholars. And that is taken absolutely no notice of in research frameworks, as far as I know. Things like, even things about getting books and articles translated. There's a whole lot of translation going on. Doesn't get mentioned, isn't recorded, isn't a way of rating people.
I took part in a conference recently where this issue was being discussed in terms of publication. We had a panel of journal editors who were being asked about their policies towards multi-language publishing. And it became apparent quickly that there's a whole lot of issues there. It's not just about translating what somebody's writing from one language to another, but there's a whole research tradition that you have to translate. It's a whole set of knowledge that maybe people in different language communities are not aware of amongst themselves. So I think there's a really big issue there. Colleagues from Sweden that I've talked to feel really strongly about this. They have work that they need to. They're publishing in Swedish, and they want that to be acknowledged in an English-speaking environment. But it's just really difficult at the moment. So I think it's really important. We made an effort in our research sample to include some multilingual scholars, but we didn't get many of them, actually. Yeah. So I think they're underrepresented probably in our research. And there's more work to be done, and a collaborative project with other countries would kind of foreground that issue much better than we've been able to, I think.
I think that would be a really interesting variable to factor in, especially with your example with the collaborative grant.
Yeah.
Anecdotally, working in Spain, I was seen as the final filter for everything to go on. So that crafting would occur by the native speaker.
Yeah.
Although I was always told I wasn't a native speaker because I was from the other side of the world. But that it sort of came through a funnel rather than being like, it seems like every space that you had was equally valued. But really, when you think about multilingualism, it's sort of, but every space is equal, but it comes through one final funnel, and that would definitely change.
Yeah.
my writing in Spanish has always been said, "You're too direct, Gemma." Academic culture. You're too direct. You're coming across as rude. Like, well, I'm getting the point across, and that's very communication in an English way, but in other languages, as you said, academic culture of different countries.
Yeah, and there's quite a lot of work done in the area of kind of looking at academics whose first language is not English, and comparing the way articles are written, and looking even at things like phrase length and complexity of sentences and those kinds of things, which, But I think that with the Diane example, the interesting thing is it never occurred to her even to mention in the interview what language these meetings were held in. The assumption was it would be in English. And there is an academic lingua franca that enables these kinds of high-speed collaborations to happen.
Did it come through a funnel at the end? Some sort of.
When she spoke to us predominantly about her own work package, which she was leading on. So she's a native English speaker, so she would be the funnel for that. But yeah, there's a whole new tranche of English language professionals across Europe who serve that funneling purpose. Yeah.
Do we have any by email back in there? No. I've checked Twitter, that's why I was fiddling with my phone. I wasn't completing my shopping. Checking others.
We'd be interested in any kind of resonances with their own experiences, really, to what we've said and what we've found from people in the project.
It struck me that one way you can take all of this is to talk about the conjunction between writing and time. That's always what I think of when someone says social media. I think of time.
Yeah, time. Absolutely crucial. And a lot of this, the kinds of things that are now becoming possible because we have these new digital platforms, as Ibrar was saying, putting this stuff up for the students, it's almost seen as being atemporal. We can produce these documents, we can put them up, and the time that is taken is invisible. Email is invisible because we don't actually see. If everybody came in every day to a stack of 100 written things in their pigeonhole to read and respond to, some of them paper clipped to 10, 15, 20 page documents that they're expected to turn around instantly, it would be a very visible workload. But everybody, it's interesting how people individualise issues with email. Many people say, well, I'm terrible at dealing with my email, assuming that other people can deal with it quickly. There's an enormous invisible workload and invisible time commitment, as you say, hidden in everybody's email inbox.
Yeah, and then the space is linked in with the time as well, because a lot of this work goes on at home, as Karin mentioned earlier on. It's not actually virtual space. It has physical repercussions on people's personal lives and their families and so on. And people make big kind of decisions and try to strategize that. When am I going to be in the office? When I can concentrate on the work I've got to do? When do I need to escape to somewhere where I can be uninterrupted?
Could you do that, Mary? Could you with your computer tracking and stalking expand thinking of evil?
No, I
think. Can you see when people switch between programs?
Yeah.
You can go when they go to where their data is to where the Word document is.
Yeah.
And that's the email in the background.
Well, there's a knock on the door.
Because we have the webcam as well, so
we've got a video cam as well.
So we can see when the student comes in and asks about the piece of writing, and the person leaves what they were working on for 10 minutes, talks to the student, comes back.
And it sounds very organised the way that Ibrar yourself set it. Is it?
Do you know, one of the things that we've found people are doing very often, that they didn't tell us about in the interviews, but that comes up when we analyse the screen capture stuff, is searching for things. A great deal of time is spent searching for references, searching for things buried in an email attachment somewhere, searching for something I know that I've written that would fit in here, but I can't remember where I filed it.
Searching for what I've just been working on.
People didn't tell us about that, but a lot of time is spent in That's invisible.
The example that was shown up there, that was where the email details were blurred out. That person, like other people, had his, as a default mode, had the email screen open all the time, except when he was working on something else. It was always open, and he was working away. And the email was always there, so every so often there'd be a ping, and he'd have to respond to it or choose not to. But even choosing not to requires a tiny bit of work. And it's amazing because in that example, he's doing an examiner report for a Viva, and we captured all of it. And as soon as he ends the session, he gets an email saying, "Can you do this Viva for somebody else? Can you give me a list of all the examinations you've done, PhD examinations?" And he copies and pastes the list, and then adds the one he's currently just doing to that list and submits it. So it's the speed of how cyclical it all is. It's immediate, and but that particular academic does all his research writing, monograph writing at home, and he only comes in specifically to do teaching related work. So
I think the methodology that we've ended up with is different from what we planned at the beginning of the project, because we had to capture people in their offices. Very difficult to set that up at home, but actually we're missing really significant amounts of the writing people are doing. But it's still really, really interesting and rich data that we've got. So we feel like we're innovating on this particular aspect, and there's a lot further to go with it.
we have mathematicians scribbling as well. Scribbles that they do as they're around the campus. We've recorded those through digital pens. So it's not just desk-based. It's kind of peripatetic.
Yeah. But actually, this thing about emails and how people handle emails and the interruptions and the chaos and the searching, this is one of the aspects where people do have more autonomy than they might be aware of. And we've looked at the different ways in which different participants have set boundaries around. Some people will say, 37, 40 hours a week, I'll have my email open, the rest of the time is my time. So that's a time boundary. Some people will say, I put my iPhone in a drawer when I get home so I can't look at it, and I try really hard not to take it out of the drawer at 10 o'clock at night. So it's a kind of space device boundaries. People set boundaries in different ways. I think one of the issues is that these changes in communicative practices have been so rapid that we don't actually have shared cultural expectations around how those boundaries can be set or should be set, or what's appropriate or what's expected, and every department has its own kind of email culture that you pick up when you come into it. So I think that is one of those areas where, if you think about it, there is more autonomy, but it's not just a question of individual responsibility, it's a question of cultural responsibility and also kind of managerial responsibility to make those expectations quite clear. That's often not done.
Okay, so to insert a time boundary, we've come to the end. Before we thank you for such a good seminar, just to say that the next CGHE seminar is next Thursday, which I will be giving on measuring teaching excellence, challenges and possibilities. That will be in London, but you don't have to go to London. It will also be live streamed, so if you're interested, that would be great. I'd like to thank you for such a thought-provoking and productive seminar. I think the question I'm left with is, what would a multilingual